Hey, yo, what up, my people? We back. And before I kick this thing off, I gotta shout out some people. Shout out to Katrina for that $2 super thanks. And shout out to Brian7901 for that $10 super thanks. I really appreciate that. Solo D, what up, my guy? Keep grinding, keep doing your thing. And last but not least, I want to shout out to all my sources behind the scene. When you give me a story of yours, when you give me a story of your family members, you are contributing to the channel. You are contributing to the content. Because of you, I have a new video and we're gonna get them joints out. Just know that the process does take long sometimes because I'm very thorough with my information. So without further ado, let's get into it. I go by D-Jack, but you can call me D. So I go extra hard on that hard flow. Call me D. Now we're gonna begin smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Born in the small town of Robinson, North Carolina in the year 1932 was a man named James Dyral Briley Sr. And born 2 years later in 1935 was Bertha Council inside a small town as well in Hamilton, North Carolina. James will begin dating her by the young age of 16, with Bertha being 14 years old, living just 15 minutes away from one another. After being a couple for a little over 3 to 4 years, Bertha becomes pregnant with her first child, Edward Jerome Briley, in October of 1951. You can imagine back in these days how traditional structures played a pivotal role in family values, being that marriage was always expected to happen before babies were to be born. And it's thought that the couple had a shotgun wedding just 3 months later on January 23rd of 1952. James was now 19 and Bertha was 16. So with the knots tied, they were ready to kickstart their lives together. And July 7th of that year, Edward Jerome Briley, who they nicknamed Boot, would finally make his way into the world. They would move from North Carolina to Richmond, Virginia, laying down roots in the Highland Park neighborhood. It's the 1950s. A lot of our men who weren't killed in duty were a few years removed from World War II. Black and white picture frames, women wore hairstyles like the soft bob, the pixie cut. This is also a time when segregation and Jim Crow were in full effect. And the history of our small city runs deep. Shockoe Bottom was the center of Richmond's slave trade back in 1841. So over 100 years later, the descendants of those times would see better days. But it wouldn't be another decade until things were completely changed forever. And before it comes to fruition, from the years 1954 to 1958, the Briley brother trio would be born. Oldest of the three, Linwood Briley, was born March 26, 1954. Next up, James Dyral Briley, or JB, was born June 6 in 1956. And lastly, Anthony Ray Briley was born February 17th in 1958. So as they would say, the gang's all here. It seemed like Bertha had no breaks with delivering child after child, and we could only speculate on her mental standpoint, but it couldn't have been easy for her to be in prenatal care for almost a decade straight, no matter how normal it was considered to be. Now, the Briley family upheld a well-to-do reputation throughout their neighborhood, being regarded as hard-working parents who were just overall good people. Now, James Briley Sr. worked as a school concrete factory technician, and Bertha held a position at Virginia Union, taking a lane in food services. Life for the Briley children was as good as any two-parent household inside a middle-class neighborhood. So details of what changed for them over the years would be little but far from unnoticeable. As we know, there's one thing that remains true in all generations in time, and that's structure, discipline, and law and order in the household, especially in the black communities. It was always said that the only person that the brothers revered was their father, and due to events that are soon to happen in the near future, it's alleged that James Sr. made his presence felt, but maybe a little too much. Was he the father and husband everyone thought him to be? And it all would come into question when their eldest child, Edward, would ask to move to North Carolina with relatives at the age of 13. Some locals say that they were good people. Others say James Sr. wasn't a good man at all, because soon after Edward's departure from home, their mother, Bertha, wasn't too far behind, and the boy's unusual behavior was said to be the main reason for her departure. 2 members of their family would just abandon the rest and never come back. The role that a mother plays in a child's life itself is too important, so it had to be good reasons, maybe even sinister ones. Multiple accounts stating James' character to be that of a mask. He shows you what he wants you to see, while others say they've seen the mask slip, but no one has concrete evidence otherwise. Anthony, Linwood, and JB were regarded by neighbors as young people who would help them around the house. odd jobs like repairing cars and mowing lawns. But as the Briley clan got older, they come into themselves a lot more. Their personalities are developing and their interests in things are changing. They would pick up one of the more extreme hobbies by indulging in the collection of exotic pets. And not just exotic, but dangerous as well. It's a free-minded decision to make, and depending on who you are, it would determine said decision. So as far as decisions goes, the brothers love to watch their pets hunting its prey, getting a rush while feeding live mice to them on a regular basis. Now the brothers' school experience would mirror the early signs of predator behavior by them being considered bullies toward their classmates. It became easy to slip on a mask of their own for the neighbors, but show their true colors toward their peers at school. An old classmate of the Brileys would later say that they remembered the brothers having their way with anyone they chose to victimize that day. Their attitudes changed drastically, but the oldest of the three was a little more advanced, Linwood. He go from hard-working young boy who helped out his neighbors to an arrogant deviant who outwardly displayed a lack of remorse. So moving on, the house wasn't a home anymore. Mom's gone, big brother's gone. It was only Linwood, JB, Anthony, and their father James Sr. And by now, their father had been scared to death, padlocking his door from the inside overnight. And this was every night. There was clearly a void between the brothers and James Sr., but none of us may never know the real reason why. January 28th, 1971, Linwood is 16, James Jr. is 14, and Anthony is 12 years old. On this day, James Jr. and Anthony would be the only ones to attend school, while Linwood, who was suspended from school, stayed home in his bedroom. Meanwhile, there's a 52-year-old woman by the name of Orlean Christian, who was the Brileys' next-door neighbor, hanging clean laundry out to dry on a clothesline in the backyard. She had just buried her husband, and because of this, family and friends were still gathered at the home for a repast or moral support. And in this very moment, Linwood would open his bedroom window with the rifle in hand. He aims in Miss Christian's direction and fires. She instantly hits the ground. Linwood taking a box of bullets and rifle down to the basement. Now from the inside of Miss Christian's home, several people were privy to the moment she collapsed and rushed out to help. So as the middle class block fills up with EMTs and officers, those who were first on scene and even family members thought the initial cause of death was a heart attack. And her age, coupled with stress of losing her husband, wouldn't be far-fetched to say the least. But that biased assumption and sloppy detective work would overwrite the actual reason she died that day. So if for any reason the funeral home decided not to return a robe that Miss Christian was wearing at the time, this case would have closed just as quickly as it opened. And upon the return of this robe, family members spotted a small hole with a little blood around it, thus calling the funeral home to inquire about it. And after the same mortician inspected the body for a second time, he found the bullet hole where it would be if the robe was still worn. This was a .22 caliber bullet extracted from the body. So days after the shooting, police began their investigation looking for a match. Now, because of everyone's lack of awareness, thinking the death was natural, they were at a disadvantage far as evidence is concerned. There were no cartridge casings or other overt physical clues. A Richmond police detective by the name of Norman Harding would talk to the EMTs who moved the body, and they gave him a ballpark location of where she was found. And thinking smart, Norman, he made way to a lumber yard. He bought a board from there, cutting it the length and size of Miss Christian, and drilled a hole exactly matching the placement of where the bullet made impact. Now, upon reaching Miss Christian's home yet again, he placed the board where she'd been standing when she was shot. He then peeked through the hole, noticing immediately that there were only two places this bullet could have come from: the Briley home and the home next door. During this time, officials would claim that the house next to the Brileys was vacant, so Norman focused solely on the Brileys' home. Upon knocking, James Sr. opened the door to greet him, surprised by the police presence, and Norman would ask if he had owned a .22. Shows up at the door with it, and this gave probable cause to search the home. And inside the basement is where they'd find the same brand of bullets taken out of their dead neighbor. After a few days of lab tests and analysis, it's confirmed. So Norman returned to the house and arrested Linwood. His brothers watched as he was taken out of the house in cuffs, and after 5 minutes alone with the detective, Linwood would make the case that he was shooting at birds between the Christian house and his own. But Norman would say no dead birds could be found at the scene. Plus, Linwood's shots would have gone over Miss Christian's head if he had indeed been aiming at birds. But other than Linwood's blatant lies, Norman was more shocked by what he would say next, which were, and I quote, "She ain't have that long to live. She was gonna die anyway, so this would be without any known motive or right to do so." In other words, an elderly woman's life was snuffed out for the fun of it. So fast forward into his sentencing on February 22nd, 1971, even with no one believing his bird hunting story, involuntary manslaughter was all police could prove in court. Linwood Briley was then committed to the Beaumont Learning Center, and he would only spend 8 short months before he was released. So after Linwood's arrest, he would become a role model for his younger brothers. Described as braggadocious, intelligent, but also cold, calculating, and even methodical. And it all came gift-wrapped with a deviant undertone, and the younger brothers would follow his lead, almost looked up to Linwood for guidance as their leader. James was more emotional and not as smart as Linwood, but carried that similar careless arrogance as his older brother. And James Jr. would be the first to take a step in Big Bro's direction. January 11th, 1973, it's late Thursday night around 10:30 p.m. on the south side of Richmond, and James Jr. along with another boy named Thomas Edward Webb hung out in front of a 7-Eleven off of Jefferson Davis Highway. They did this for a brief time, and eventually Thomas enters the store and asks the attendant for a paper bag. No sooner does James pull out a .38 caliber pistol, ordering him to put the money in the bag. Meanwhile, as the clerk handed them $159 from the register, which is worth a little over $1,000 today, an officer who just so happens to be driving past saw James and Thomas running away from the store. Making their way up Ingham Street, James fires a few shots at the police, and the police in return shooting James in the back. His friend Thomas would end up eluding the police by running into some bushes, but was caught later on in the week. Now, James was taken to MCV that night in stable condition with the bullet entering his back and would leave his body through his lower right chest. The police then obtained warrants charging James with attempted murder of an officer and armed robbery. And James Jr. would spend the next 5 to 6 years in juvenile detention and wouldn't reunite with his brothers until 8 months into the year of 1979. The early 1970s in Richmond was a melting pot of underground clubs, head shops, and clothing stores. Crime was on the rise, and a loaf of bread costed a nickel and 2 dimes. The city will also see its first majority black city council and our first black mayor. If you were crossing the water over to the north, you run into the Jackson Ward district, and this area was considered home to over 100 African American owned businesses, thriving and surviving, as they would say. But there's no good without an evil, because just as we celebrate our victories, we had to adapt to our losses. The mid-late 70s brought a new fear into the city of Richmond. Parents cuffing their children not knowing who would be the next victim. So as we venture a few years, the time will come where this fear caused many to stay inside their homes, hiding from a group of murderers who randomly assassinated people for fun. March 12th, 1979. It's around 8:45 p.m. and we're on the east end of Richmond, specifically Henrico County. Linwood dressed in a red jumpsuit, and the youngest brother, Anthony, wore a leather jacket and a skull cap. They would be out, roaming a quiet neighborhood on Lafayette Avenue, scheming on a house to rob. With Linwood being the brains, he cooked up a plan to knock on random doors, claiming to have car trouble or to use the phone. This would give them direct view into the homes to predict how many people may be inside. Upon knocking on the doors of 2 different families, they were turned down by both. So the third time would be the charm, as they approached the home of William and Virginia Butcher. But this time, a simple refusal wouldn't be enough to make the brothers just walk away. Virginia Butcher answers the door, and after listening to Linwood's pleas to enter her home and use the phone, she turned him down also. And before she could close the door, Linwood pulled out a pistol and signaled for Anthony to fall in behind them, forcing their way inside. They end up having a minor scuffle with the husband William, afterward tying the Butchers up with ropes that they found around the house. Now subdued and unable to move, they ransacked the place for appliances, electronics, jewelry, even took the wedding bands off the couple's fingers. After taking what they could, while walking around the house with the flammable liquid, they went from room to room, And once they were done, they ignited it, with the butchers still tied up, and made a clean getaway in one of the butcher's cars, leaving the married couple for dead. As the flames spread, William managed to untie his ropes binding his hands and feet and then freed his wife. Sometime during the attack, William had been cut, so upon escaping this burning home with his wife, his bleeding right arm wrapped in a towel, they both flagged down a fellow Henrico man driving up the street. And only seconds would pass as fire and rescue squads would arrive on scene, knowing now that their nightmare was over. William was treated and was in stable condition, while his wife Virginia remained uninjured. As for the butcher's car, Richmond police would later find it abandoned by the brothers on Marside Avenue. And believe it or not, by this point in their crime spree, which was fairly early, no one knew it was the Briley brothers behind the crime. So in light of the situation, even though no lives were lost, this tight-knit Henrico community organized a candlelight vigil in regards for the Butcher family. A little over a week later, on March 21st, 1979, we're still on the east end of town. Linwood and Anthony yet again would hit the streets, already having a mark in mind. They had gotten word that a food vendor named Michael Wayne McDuffie would be carrying a large amount of cash from the several businesses he had serviced that day. It isn't known where the tip came from, but they'd obtained his route information and schedule. So now, having the element of surprise, they lay in wait for Michael to arrive and abducted him in his own car. As Anthony drove the car, Linwood robbed Michael at gunpoint. Upon stopping in the Castle area of Henrico County, Michael was shot and killed, left to be found in his car days later. Aside from the murder of Miss Christian by Linwood Briley back in 1971, Michael McDuffie was the first to lose his life in what would become a vicious crime spree for 7 to 8 months. 22-year-old James Briley was still incarcerated during this time. So for now, Linwood and Anthony were a two-man army, and Richmond police still had no clue who was terrorizing the city. Now there would be an addition to the Briley brothers' crusade, and that was a 16-year-old boy named Duncan Meekins, who lived next to the Briley brothers off of 4th Avenue. He attended John Marshall High School and had a shy personality, and it's speculated that the youngest Anthony built a relationship with him early on in their childhood. But whether they knew each other or not, Duncan looked up to the brothers. He thought they were cool, powerful, a strong group of kids that would learn him the ways of a young man, so they'd take him under their wing. But in doing so, he was forced to do things he'd never do otherwise. 10 days after the stick-up murder of Michael McDuffie on March 31st of 1979, today would be the day Duncan pops his cherry. Alongside Linwood and Anthony, they took a ride to 28-year-old Edric Alvin Clark's house on the East End to confront him about a drug dispute. The conversation or argument wouldn't last long, as they would shoot him down with a .22 rifle, the same kind and brand Linwood used on his first hit as a teenage boy. Now for years, there's been speculation on how many members were actually a part of the crime spree. And it's not so much that they were members, it's more so an extra pair of hands from time to time. So the notion that the Brileys were a gang is 100% false. They were brothers, committing crimes among a few associates. And not every crime they committed was done together. Some were just two brothers, others were Duncan and one of the others. But just for the sake of the video, I will refer to them as the Briley gang in some parts of the story, just to keep it short. Now it seemed as if the Brileys was taking a 1 to 2 week hiatus before and after their crimes. Either it be to lay low, or whatever money they took would run out by then. But it's still weird to notice how exact some of the timelines were. They waited 9 days after robbing the butchers, then went on to unalive Michael McDuffie. Then it's a 10-day hiatus before they take out Edric Clark. And now just 9 days after, on April 9th, 1979, they'll brutally violate their next victim in the worst of ways. As the sun sets over the city, a woman named Mary Gowen was leaving her daughter's house on the north side after babysitting for a few hours. Her next stop would be home, an apartment on the west end of town. Little did she know that Anthony and Duncan were lurking in the parking lot of her daughter's complex and would follow her until she reached her destination. After exiting her vehicle, she walks toward the back stairway to her complex and was suddenly attacked by Anthony and Duncan, striking her over and over until she could barely move. While still outside, they took any and all belongings she had on her person, followed by Anthony having sexual intercourse with the elderly woman. Then shortly after, Duncan would do the same, Try and put yourself in the mind of a 76-year-old Mary at this point, because just when you think the worst was over, Anthony pulls out his pistol and shoots the woman point blank range in the head. Anthony and Duncan flees the scene, and somehow, some way, Mary was still alive. There was still some fight left inside her as she managed to drag herself back inside the building and knock on the door of a neighbor before she collapsed. Now, she would be in the hospital for 3 full months before she passed away on July 2nd in St. Mary's Hospital. The complications of her gunshot wound was just too severe to survive it long term. But we now know today that Mary W. Gowen fought for her life like a warrior. And strange enough, years down the line, one of Mary's daughters, Nancy Gowen, would come into contact with another one of Richmond's vicious killers, and his name was Leslie Butcher, a man who took the lives of several homeless people, but a story that we'll definitely dive deeper into in a future video. Now, the same results from previous crimes will repeat itself for this one, as no arrests were made in this case. But this will be the point where police believed this shooting may have been tied in with several other shootings and attacks on people in the north side. So they were a ways behind, and the Briley brothers were nowhere near done with their reign of terror. Now, there was a case unknown to the city at the time where a man nearly dies in his encounter with the Briley brothers. A Southside resident, William Pullo, was getting out of his car in front of his home on May 9th, 1979, when two men grabbed him and shoved him over the car's hood. As one man held him down and tried taking his wallet, the other fired a shot at his head, but missed, and the bullet would break the windshield instead. He tried firing again, but the gun jammed, and this is when neighbors began to look out their windows, open their doors, prompting the guys to run away. He wouldn't find out until months later that they were Linwood Briley and Duncan Meekins. William Puller would later say that being attacked by Linwood Briley as opposed to some other thug was just different. Now, this would be the first time the Briley brothers give the city some room to breathe, as they lay dormant for almost 3 months. But as we just said, just because we don't hear about it, don't mean it didn't happen. And on the day that their recent victim, Mary Gowen, passes away in the hospital, they strike again, literally.